Which RPG have you owned the longest and not played? It's today's question. And this one, like all of them seem to have been for me, is interesting. First of all, I should say that I don't typically hold on to games that I know I'm not going to play. I have always been someone who gets rid of things that that I think, if I think a game isn't going to happen, I typically get rid of it. Also, over the years, through various moves from place to place, there have been some instances where I needed to downsize my gaming collection, whether it's role-playing games or board games or both. And there was a huge purge that I sold at auction back in, I want to say, between the years of 2011 and 2013. There was an auction that was held at Genghis Khan and Tacticon in Denver every year, and I used those to sell off things that just weren't going to get to the table either ever or anymore. And I just made it a habit to try to keep myself down to a couple of bookcases for games, especially with the advent of PDF. With PDF, if I need something for reference, I'm pretty comfortable to read on my iPad, and that's not a problem. I have learned that most people that say that tablets are terrible for reading PDFs don't have iPads. They tend to have Android tablets. That's another rant, of course, but I'll quickly say that Android tablets have a different aspect ratio that makes reading in portrait mode a little bit tougher. That's just my opinion, but I have seen a correlation of people that don't use PDFs and people that don't have iPads. That said, I know people with iPads that don't read PDFs either. My wife is one of them. Anyway, not important. So if we're talking about books that I physically own, I would have to look at some of the indie games I've collected over the years. And probably the one that I've owned the longest would be Dogs in the Vineyard by Vincent Baker. Always found it interesting, and my wife has not been able to get past the religious overtones of the game. She just doesn't find the concept of going from town to town and, purging it of evil in a religious sense interesting to her. I have threatened to hack the game into a Supernatural, the TV show Supernatural game. So that might happen one day. We'll see. As far as games that I've always wanted to play and haven't, I can go back to PDF because I still own the PDFs. One game I've never gotten to play, and I've always had it on my radar. I've always purchased it. Heck, I used to have a huge library of the books, physical books, would be GURPS. And this is going back to GURPS 3rd edition. I looked at it as a kid. I think it was in its 2nd edition, and then never bought it. But in 3rd edition, I bought it in big, and I just never got to run it. I saw how deadly it was when I was reading the rules, and I thought that I couldn't run it or that I wouldn't enjoy it. But now I have different opinion on games that are deadly for the characters in combat. And that's another future YouTube video. One thing that's been great about this RPG a day thing is that I have been jotting down topics that are coming to mind that don't necessarily answer the questions, but the questions bring the topics to mind. So this has been great for mining future topics after I'm through with RPG a day for this year. So now I want to talk about a game that I recently repurchased in its second edition, and I originally bought it in its first edition. And it is one of the first games I ever owned. See, I have talked about how the very first game I played was AD&D. I played in a one-on-one Monty Hall dungeon with my friend Tony. The second game I ever played was Mensner Redbox, and that was my friend Shane's game. Not Shane Hensley. I'm talking about an old friend Shane from my youth. And then the first game I ever game mastered was Star Frontiers. I didn't own any of these games. These were games other kids had. Didn't have a whole lot of money as a kid. Didn't have access to things. I don't think I bought D&D books until second edition. So I think the very first role-playing game I bought was Palladium Fantasy. We were getting tired of D&D and didn't have access to a lot of games at the time, and we were looking for a D&D replacement. So I picked up Palladium Fantasy, and keep in mind that this was the mid to late 80s, and it was, well, the Satanic Panic still hadn't gone away. My mom was not completely comfortable with me playing D&D, but was happy to know where I was when I was at my friend's house playing. So while I still played the games, even in my head, there were certain things about Satanism or demons or whatever that had kind of stuck with me from the things the adults around me were saying. So when I opened up Palladium Fantasy and started to read further, and we got into the magic section, there's I remember this whole opening in the book that said that, magic wasn't real. It was, the typical thing that you'd see in the 80s and 90s in books, and in some books today, that it wasn't real and it's just fiction and all this other stuff. But then you get into the book, and the descriptions for rituals and some of the spells scared the hell out of me. And we ended up not playing that game. And I held on to that game for a very long time. The irony of the whole thing is we ended up playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which didn't have overt language like that in it so much. But really, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is one of the darkest games, one of the darkest game settings ever written. Especially considering that I blew off Palladium Fantasy for it. I just find that hilarious. Recently, out of nostalgia, I picked up a copy of Second Edition Palladium Fantasy and been trying to read through it. Not a, I've never played the Palladium system, but I remember actually reading through Rifts, and I just didn't get it. It seemed like a clunky system, but we'll see what comes of it, if anything. But modifying the question a little bit, the game I've wanted to try the longest and never played the longest would probably be Palladium Fantasy. So I just love that story. I put Palladium Fantasy aside and instead ran Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It gets even funnier because we used Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and ran in the Dragonlance setting. We went by what we had read in the novels, not bothering with any of the actual Dragonlance D&D supplements, and but dropped Dragonlance, of all things, into Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Anyway, that's it for me today. I will, or better, more appropriately, you will see me tomorrow. And until then, do good, avoid evil, and play more games.